In 1999, Vladimir Putin was a struggling KGB agent making $300 a month. Today, intelligence agencies estimate his net worth at $200 billion. That makes him potentially richer than Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates combined. But here's what's bizarre. He never started a company. He never went public. He never built anything you can point to and say, he owns that. So where did $200 billion come from? The answer lies in a financial architecture so complex, so deliberately hidden, that even the US intelligence community only recently pieced it together. And in the next 60 minutes, we're going to walk through exactly how it works, the shell companies, the oligarchs, the offshore accounts, and the one transaction that explains everything. But before we get there, you need to understand why this matters to you. Because Putin's wealth system is becoming the template for autocrats worldwide, and what you're about to learn will change how you see power, corruption, and why certain countries collapse. Let's start in 1990. The Soviet Union is collapsing. The KGB is dissolving. And a young Vladimir Putin, an intelligence officer with no business experience, no money, no connections outside the security apparatus, is suddenly facing a world where power and money are no longer the same thing. In the Soviet Union, power was wealth. You couldn't be rich without being connected to state power. So when the state collapsed, everyone connected to it faced the same crisis. How do you convert political power into actual money? The oligarchs figured it out first. Through the 1990s, they privatized state assets, oil companies, aluminum smelters, media outlets, for pennies on the dollar. Guys like Boris Berezovsky, Roman Abramovich, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky became billionaires overnight. Putin watched this from Leningrad, then St. Petersburg, where he was working as a deputy mayor. He was making connections, building networks, but mostly staying invisible. This is crucial to understanding what comes next. Putin never wanted to be an oligarch himself. He wanted to own the oligarchs. And that distinction changes everything. When Putin became president in 2000, he had a problem and an opportunity. The problem? A handful of oligarchs controlled more wealth than the state. They had bought up oil companies, media outlets, and industrial capacity for fractions of their value. They literally owned Russia's future. The opportunity? Putin controlled the security apparatus, the FSB, the military, the courts. He had the guns. The oligarchs had the money. But money without power is just a bank account waiting to be seized. So Putin did something brilliant. He made oligarchs an offer they literally couldn't refuse. Keep your wealth. Keep your companies. Get richer if you want. But from now on, I own you. You answer to me. When I need money, you give it to me. When I need a company, you hold it for me. When I need you to disappear, you disappear. Some oligarchs got it immediately. Abramovich went into exile to avoid being prosecuted. Others, like Khodorkovsky, didn't understand the new rules. Khodorkovsky made the mistake of thinking that being richer than the president meant he had leverage. In 2003, he was arrested on tax evasion charges that were, frankly, absurd. His company's assets were seized and handed to Rosneft, a state oil company. The message was clear. The oligarchs now worked for Putin, not the other way around. By 2004, Putin had consolidated control. The oligarchs were still rich, but they were effectively nationalized, converted into Putin's personal wealth management system. Okay, so now we get to the mechanics. This is where it gets intricate, but stick with me, this is the actual blueprint of how a $200 billion fortune is built without anyone officially owning it. Russia's largest companies are technically state-owned enterprises. Companies like Rosneft, Gazprom, and Lukoil. But state ownership is fictional. The boards of these companies are packed with Putin's allies, FSB officers, and trusted oligarchs. Here's how it works. The company makes $100 billion in revenue from oil and gas exports. The government takes maybe $40 billion in taxes. The company officially reinvests $30 billion. And $30 billion gets distributed through the network. Now here's where it gets interesting. State companies start awarding contracts to shell companies. Gazprom hires a construction company to build a pipeline, except the construction company doesn't exist. It's a shell company registered in Cyprus owned by a subsidiary owned by a trust owned by a friend of Putin's. The contract price, $5 billion. Gazprom's balance sheet shows a $5 billion expense. The money flows into the shell company. The shell company then subcontracts 40% of the work to another shell company, keeping 60% as management fees. The pipeline never gets built. Or it gets built for $500 million, and $4.5 billion vanishes. Example. In 2008, a $270 million contract was awarded to build a cultural center in St. Petersburg. The contract went to Stroygazmontaj, a company owned by Putin's childhood friend Gennady Timchenko. The cultural center was never completed. The money became part of Putin's network. The shell company now has $3 billion sitting in a Cypriot bank account. But the Cypriot shell company is owned by a trust in the British Virgin Islands. The trustee is a lawyer in Panama. The beneficial owner is unknown. This money then gets moved around, sometimes held as loans that are never repaid, sometimes invested in real estate, sometimes used to purchase yachts or artwork that gets donated to Russian museums where they hang in secure rooms never seen by the public. The most brilliant part, Putin's network converts cash back into assets that are impossible to track. Luxury real estate in Dubai, London, and Miami. Yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Art collections. These assets are never registered in Putin's name, they're registered to shell companies, trusts, and friends. When Western sanctions hit, some of these assets get frozen. But by then, the money has already been moved 3 times over. It's like a shell game, except you're shuffling $200 billion. In 2015, journalists discovered a not 35 million villa on Lake Como, owned by a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands. The villa was almost certainly owned by Putin, but the title chain went, Shell Company A BVI A, Shell Company B Cyprus A, Trust administered in Panama A, Holding Company in Delaware. When you follow the actual paperwork, the money trails split into dozens of directions. By the time you reach the end, you're no longer sure which trail you were following. Here's the thing that took intelligence agencies years to understand, Putin doesn't directly own any of this. He never has to. He just owns the oligarchs. The system works because Russia's wealthiest men are essentially fronts. They hold the titles. They sign the contracts. They sit on the boards. But they answer to Putin. Gennady Timchenko, Putin's childhood friend, worth an estimated $32 billion. He made his money in oil trading and construction. He owns shares in Novatek, Russia's largest natural gas company. But more importantly, he's been photographed with Putin more times than almost anyone outside his inner circle. When Western sanctions targeted him specifically, it was because intelligence agencies concluded he's essentially Putin's proxy. Sergei Rodenberg, another childhood friend worth $4.2 billion. He owns Stroytransgaz, a construction company that has won over $7 billion in state contracts. When you look at these contracts, they're astronomical in price for the work done. The difference is essentially Putin's cut. Yuri Kovalchuk, a billionaire banker who controls Bank Rossiya. This bank has become the central hub of Putin's financial network. It processes the money, holds the accounts, and coordinates the transfers. Kovalchuk has been sanctioned multiple times because Western intelligence concluded he's essentially Putin's finance minister. Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft and a former FSB officer. He was Putin's deputy chief of staff. He personally oversees the contracts that funnel money through the system. He's never been as publicly rich as other oligarchs, but he controls tens of billions in assets through state positions. All of these men are simultaneously 1. Genuinely wealthy, they do control massive companies. 2. Completely dependent on Putin's favor. 3. Functionally extensions of Putin's will. They operate in a legal gray zone. On paper, they're private businessmen. But in reality, they're holding money and assets in trust for Putin. If Putin snaps his fingers, they lose access. If they disobey, they get arrested on manufactured charges, like Khodorkovsky, or, accidentally, crash their helicopters. This is actually brilliant from a corruption standpoint. It gives Putin deniability. He can say, I'm not a billionaire. I'm a government employee making $130,000 a year. And technically, that's true. He never took the money. His friends did, except his friends can't actually use the money without his permission. By the way, these oligarchs have all had family members imprisoned, threatened, or exiled at various points. Rodenberg's brother was arrested on drug charges in 2010, then released when the point had been made. Timchenko's daughter was given a visa to the US, then it was revoked as a subtle reminder of who has the power. This isn't just corruption, it's sophisticated hostage-taking on a national scale. Alright, let's make this concrete with actual documented cases. These aren't theories. These are things that intelligence agencies, journalists, and tax authorities have actually uncovered. Alexei Navalny, Putin's most famous opposition figure, released a detailed investigation into a palace. Not just any palace, a 1,700-room compound on the Black Sea coast, reportedly worth $1.35 billion. It has a helicopter pad, underground tunnels, a private beach, and multiple swimming pools. The palace was theoretically owned by Svetlana Krivinogova, a woman with no public wealth or connections. How did she get $1.35 billion? According to investigators, the money came through a chain of shell companies linked to Timchenko. The construction contracts were awarded to companies connected to Rotenberg. The financing came through Bank Russia. The utilities, electricity, water are billed to shell companies that have no other purpose. Navalny concluded this was Putin's personal palace. Putin denied it, but the structure of the ownership and financing is so obvious that even a casual observer understands what's happening. In 2010, Gazprom awarded a contract to construct a gas pipeline in western Russia. The contract went to a shell company owned by, you guessed it, Gennady Timchenko. The contract price, $500 million. The actual pipeline, completed for approximately $50 million. The difference, $450 million, vanished into the network. Investigators traced the funds through Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and back into Russian real estate holdings. The pipeline was unnecessary. Russia already had adequate gas infrastructure in that region. The contract existed for one reason, to move $450 million from state coffers into the oligarch network. Between 2014 and 2021, Putin's associates purchased over $5 billion worth of yachts. These aren't normal yachts. We're talking about $500 million superyachts with helicopter pads and underwater observatories. Gennady Timchenko owns the Lena, a $160 million yacht registered in the British Virgin Islands. Sergei Rotenberg's family owns the Luna, a $115 million yacht. What's interesting? These oligarchs aren't the types to spend their free time sailing. They're not on Instagram showing off their yachts. The yachts are almost never used. They're held for months in private shipyards. They're purchased using shell companies and immediately transferred through ownership structures. Why? Because a yacht is a liquid asset. If sanctions hit, you can move it. You can hide it. It's harder to track than real estate. When the U.S. Treasury actually sanctioned some of these yachts in 2022, after the Ukraine invasion, billions of dollars worth of assets were frozen. This gave us a rare glimpse into exactly how vast the network actually is. Bank Russia is Russia's 13th largest bank. Until 2022, you probably hadn't heard of it. But it's possibly the most important financial institution in Russia. Why? Because Bank Russia is where the money goes. State companies deposit revenues. Oligarchs transfer funds. Shell companies hold accounts. When the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Bank Russia in 2014, they explicitly stated it was being used to launder money for Putin. The bank, they said, serves as a hub for moving money through the system. Yuri Kovalchuk, the bank's owner, has never been charged with a crime in Russia. But U.S. intelligence concluded he's essentially Putin's finance minister, the guy who manages the actual money. Okay, so Putin's got $200 billion hidden through shell companies and oligarch proxies. Why should you care? You're probably not Russian. You're probably not one of Putin's oligarchs. So what? The answer is, this is becoming the global template for authoritarianism. Every autocrat is watching how Putin did this. Xi Jinping's government is replicating the system in China. MBS in Saudi Arabia is using similar structures. Even some smaller dictators are copying the playbook. First, it makes democracy more fragile. When you understand how much wealth is actually at stake, when you understand that $200 billion is literally the lifeblood of the Russian state, you understand why Putin can't allow elections or opposition. If he loses power, he loses everything. Literally everything. Every dollar vanishes because every dollar was obtained through his position. This is why Putin invaded Ukraine despite the economic costs. He couldn't afford to lose. If he fell from power, his entire network would be prosecuted, his assets seized. Second, it explains why sanctions are so effective, and so ineffective. Sanctions work because they freeze assets and threaten the network. They're terrifying to Putin because they literally cost him billions. But they don't work completely because so much of the wealth is already distributed, already hidden, already converted into hard assets. It's like trying to put out a fire by cutting off the supply of new wood, except most of the forest was already burned and converted into ash you can't trace. Third, it matters because Western institutions have been complicit. London real estate, Swiss banks, Cypriot shell companies, Panamanian trusts, all of these are part of international financial systems that were happy to take Russian money without asking where it came from. When we talk about the world order, or global stability, we're partly talking about a system that enabled this kind of corruption to flourish. Here's what we don't know, the things that keep intelligence analysts up at night. How much is actually hidden? The $200 billion estimate comes from multiple sources, but it's an estimate. Some analysts think it's higher, possibly $400 billion. Some think it's lower. We genuinely don't know. Where is it all? We've identified properties, yachts, and accounts. But there's almost certainly a significant portion we haven't found. Probably held through structures so complex that even financial experts can't trace them. Who actually owns what? This is the core mystery. Some of the oligarchs might genuinely be independent. Some might be fronts. Some might be co-owners. The structure is deliberately ambiguous. What happens after Putin? This is the big one. If Putin dies or loses power, what happens to $200 billion? Does it get seized by a successor? Does the oligarch network hold it? Does it become the prize for civil conflict? How much has been spent? Putin's been accumulating wealth for 25 years. He's bought palaces, paid for wars, funded propaganda operations. Some analysts think he's already spent or committed $100 billion. If that's true, his actual wealth acquisition has been even more vast than we think. These are the mysteries that international intelligence agencies are actively trying to solve right now. So here's what we know. In 25 years, Vladimir Putin converted control of a nuclear superpower into a $200 billion personal fortune, without ever officially owning anything. He did it by creating a system where state companies generate wealth. That wealth is transferred through fake contracts. The money is hidden through shell companies and oligarch proxies. Assets are converted into yachts, real estate, and art. Everything is deliberately untraceable. It's not technically illegal under Russian law, because Putin controls Russian law. It's not fully prosecutable under international law, because so much of it is technically hidden. It's not even really surprising. Corruption at this scale is just how authoritarian systems work. But what's remarkable is that we can see it. We can document it. The SWIFT payments, the property registrations, the court records, the leaked documents, they all exist. Intelligence agencies, journalists, and financial analysts have pieced together the actual architecture. Which means Putin's system isn't hidden anymore. It's just too complex and too vast to fully prosecute. It's like knowing exactly where a criminal hides the money but finding that it's distributed across 10,000 different locations in 50 different countries. The real question isn't, how did Putin get rich? We know that. The real question is, how many other leaders are doing the exact same thing, and how do we actually stop it? This system only works if there are places to hide money, international financial centers that don't ask questions. It only works if there are oligarchs willing to front the money and governments willing to recognize shell company ownership. It works because the international system that was built after World War II, a system designed to prevent authoritarian wealth accumulation, has itself been penetrated and corrupted. That's the real story, not how Putin made his money, but how the global financial system let him.